The storming of Berlin. On April 20, 1945, troops of the Third Shock Army of the First Belarusian Front in the northeast reached the distant approaches to Berlin. At 1:50 p.m., the long-range artillery of Major General Perevertkin's 79th Rifle Corps opened fire on the German capital, thus began the storming of Berlin. On April 21, troops of the 3rd Shock, 2nd Guards Tank, and 47th Armies broke through to the outskirts of the German capital and began fighting for the city. By the end of the day, the 8th Guards Army and the 1st Guards Tank Army also began to break through the city's defensive perimeter. Meanwhile, the troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front were also rapidly rushing towards the Beast's Lair. On April 20, Kinev's tank armies reached the southern approaches to Berlin. On April 21, Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army broke into the southern outskirts of the city. Lelyushenko's 4th Guards Tank Army reached Potsdam. On April 25, Zhukov's and Kinev's troops joined forces west of Berlin in the Ketzen area. All of Berlin found itself encircled. The fighting on the streets of the German capital was exceptionally fierce. The German High Command, trying to delay its end, threw all its forces into the battle. The Germans fought desperately and stubbornly. Berlin was prepared for a brutal battle. The defense was built on strong strongpoints and centers of resistance, into which all powerful and strong buildings were turned, on a well-organized system of fire. The communications system, including underground ones, made it possible to transfer reinforcements and reserves to dangerous areas and launch surprise attacks, including on areas already cleared by Soviet troops. Ammunition and food supplies were sufficient for a month. However, virtually all of these supplies were located on the outskirts of the city, so as the encirclement tightened, the ammunition situation deteriorated sharply. Berlin had a large garrison. About 200,000 soldiers were blockaded in the city area. The remnants of the defeated units defending the Berlin direction retreated here, including the 56th Panzer Corps. They were reinforced in the city. The police, civilians, all auxiliary and rear services, and the Hitler Youth were also mobilized for the defense of Berlin, forming numerous militia battalions. As a result, the total number of the Berlin garrison exceeded 300,000 men. On April 24, 1945, General Weidling, who had previously commanded the 56th Panzer Corps, took over the city's defense from Raymond. The Soviet troops faced a complex task. A vast city, numerous strong multi-story buildings with massive walls, bomb shelters, and casemates, all connected by underground communications. Numerous canals ran through the city, which had to be crossed under enemy fire. German troops offered desperate and skillful resistance. The Spree River bisected the German capital, protecting the ministerial buildings in the center of Berlin. Every building in the city center was defended by a strong garrison, often up to a battalion strong. The Red Army drew on its extensive experience in street fighting in Stalingrad, Budapest, Königsberg, and other cities. German positions were stormed day and night. All efforts were directed at preventing the enemy from organizing a strong defense. The Soviet armies acted in echelons. The first echelon attacked during the day, the second at night. Each army had its own sector of attack. Units and subunits were to occupy specific streets, squares, and objectives. The capital's key objectives, major strongholds, were subjected to powerful artillery and air strikes. From April 21 to May 2, 1945, 1,800,000 artillery rounds were fired at the German capital. On the third day of the assault, fortress guns arrived at the Selitsky station and fired at central Berlin. Each shell weighed up to half a ton and crushed enemy defenses. On April 25 alone, the city was bombed by 2,000 bombers. However, the main role in the storming of Berlin was played by assault groups and detachments, which included infantry, engineers, tanks and self-propelled guns, as well as artillery. Almost all artillery, including 152 mm and 203 mm guns, was transferred to the infantry and fired direct fire, destroying enemy firing positions and fortifications. Assault units also supported tanks and self-propelled guns. The other armored units operated as part of tank corps and armies, which were operationally subordinate to the command of combined arms armies or had their own offensive zone. However, the decision to deploy large mobile units to accelerate the operation resulted in heavy tank losses from enemy artillery and Panzerfaust fire. By the end of April 25, 1945, the German garrison occupied an area of approximately 325 square kilometers. The total length of the Soviet front in Berlin was approximately 100 kilometers. The storming of the capital involved over 450,000 Soviet soldiers, more than 12,500 guns and mortars, over 2,000 rocket launchers, up to 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns. On April 26, 1945, Soviet troops divided the German forces into two groups, in the area of the islands of Wannsee and Potsdam. The commander of Army Group Vistula, General Heinrici, approached headquarters with a request to halt Army Group Steiner's offensive from the Oranienburg area on Berlin. The reason given was the lack of any prospects for success. The Army Group needed to be redeployed to save the front of the 3rd Panzer Army, which was collapsing under the blows of Rokossovsky's troops. The German Supreme Command rejected this proposal. Hitler insisted on continuing the offensive with the goal of unblocking the capital. The Führer still hoped for a miracle. He ordered the 9th Army, which found itself in the Halbe pocket, to break through to the north, and the 12th Army to move west to save Berlin. However, the encircled German 9th Army's furious attempts to break out of the cauldron were unsuccessful. Only a few thousand German soldiers managed to reach the Elbe, where they surrendered to the Allies. The 200,000-strong German force was completely destroyed by Konev and Zhukov's troops in fierce fighting. Attempts by Wenck's 12th Army to break through to meet the 9th Army were also unsuccessful. As a result, the combat potential of the 12th Army was exhausted. On April 27, Soviet troops destroyed an enemy group in the Potsdam area. Our troops captured the Central Railway Junction. Fighting raged for the central 9th sector of the capital. On April 28, the Red Army breached the defenses of the central sector of the German capital in a number of areas. The 79th Rifle Corps of the 3rd Shock Army commander, Colonel General N.P. Kuznetsov, advancing from the north, occupied the Midi district and reached the Spree River north of the central part of the Tiergarten Park. Thousands of prisoners, citizens of the Allied armies, were freed from Moabit prison. Units of the 5th Shock Army commander, Lieutenant General N.E. Berzarin, advancing from the east, took Karlhorst, crossed the Spree, and occupied Anhalt Station and the State Printing House building. Soviet soldiers fought their way to Alexanderplatz, the Emperor Wilhelm Palace, the Town Hall, and the Imperial Chancellery. The 8th Guards Army, under the command of General V. I. Chuikov, broke through along the southern bank of the Landwehr Canal and approached the southern part of the Tiergarten. Troops from other Soviet armies also advanced successfully. The Nazis continued to fight fiercely, but the hopelessness of the situation was obvious to the German command. At 10 p.m. on April 28, General Weidling proposed a plan to Hitler for a breakout from the capital. He reported that there was only enough ammunition for 2 days left, and the main depots were located on the outskirts of the city. The chief of the General Staff of the Army, General Hans Krebs, supported this idea, stating that from a military standpoint, a breakout from Berlin was possible. As Weidling recalled, the Führer pondered for a long time. He understood the situation was hopeless, but believed that attempting a breakout would only lead them from one pocket to another. Field Marshal Keitel, stationed at the headquarters of the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht OKW, removed General Heinrici and his Chief of Staff, General von Trotha, from command of Army Group Vistula. They had failed to carry out Hitler's order to break through to Berlin. However, even the new commander of Army Group Vistula, General Kurt von Tippelskirch, was powerless to help the capital. By that point, little remained of the army group. On April 29, Jodl received his last telegram from Hitler. In it, the Führer demanded that he be informed about the situation of the 9th and 12th Armies and about the 41st Tank Corps of General Holst as part of the 12th Army, which was supposed to break through the encirclement of Berlin. On April 30, Keitel reported to Führer headquarters that the advance units of Wenck's 12th Army had been stopped by the Russians in the area south of Lake Schwelau Sea. Holst's corps had gone over to the defensive. The army could not continue its advance on Berlin. The 9th Army remained encircled, storming the Reichstag. Meanwhile, Kuznetsov's and Berzarin's 3rd and 5th Shock Armies, Bogdanov's and Katakov's 2nd and 1st Guards Tank Armies, Chuikov's 8th Guards Army, units of the 1st Belarusian Front, Luchinsky's 28th Army and Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front, were completing their assault on Berlin. On the night of April 29, the 171st and 150th Rifle Divisions of the 79th Corps captured the only bridge across the river, the Moltke Bridge, that had not been destroyed by the Nazis. Having crossed the river, Soviet infantry began preparing to storm the Reichstag, the approaches to which were covered by powerful stone fortifications, machine gun emplacements, and artillery emplacements. First, Soviet assault detachments took the corner building southeast of the Moltke Bridge. In the morning, the battle began for the enemy's well-fortified strongholds on Königsplatz, the Himmler House building and the Imperial Theatre Kroll Opera. By the morning of April 30, the Himmler House, the Ministry of Internal Affairs building, had been cleared of Nazis. At the same time, fierce fighting continued for the buildings adjacent to the Ministry of Internal Affairs building. Heavy fighting also took place for the theater building, the Kroll Opera, from which the Germans could fire on the Ministry of Internal Affairs building and the Moltke Bridge. On April 30, in the middle of the day, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. According to the Führer's last will, Joseph Goebbels assumed the post of Reich Chancellor. He held this position for only 1 day. Admiral Donitz received the post of Reich President. Bormann became Minister for Party Affairs. Field Marshal Schörner was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Army. General Jodl became Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief. On April 30, the assault on the Reichstag began. That same day, the remnants of the Berlin garrison were cut into several parts. The Germans repelled the initial attacks by units of the 79th Corps with heavy fire. Only at 2:25 p.m. did the battalions under the command of Neostroev, Samsonov, and Davidov break into the building. Lieutenant Rakimjan Koshkarbayev and Private Grigory Bulatov planted the red banner at the main entrance. The fighting was fierce. They fought for every floor, every room, corridor, basements, and attics. The gunfire escalated into hand-to-hand combat. The building was burning, but the fighting continued. At 10:40 p.m., the red banner was placed in the crown of the sculpture of the Goddess of Victory. However, the Germans continued to fight. They lost the upper floors of the Reichstag, but entrenched themselves in the basements. The fighting continued even on May 1. Only on the morning of May 2, 1945, did the remnants of the Reichstag garrison surrender. The red banner was hoisted by soldiers of the 756th Rifle Regiment. This banner became the banner of victory. At the same time, fighting in other districts of the capital was ending. On May 1, Goebbels instructed General Krebs to begin negotiations with the Soviet command. Krebs delivered a message to the headquarters of the 8th Guards Army about the death of the Führer and requested a ceasefire in order to create conditions for the beginning of peace negotiations between the Reich and the Soviet Union. This was reported to Zhukov, and then to Stalin. Moscow insisted on unconditional surrender. Receiving a negative answer and seeing no way out, Goebbels committed suicide. That same day, General Krebs also shot himself in the Führer bunker. Bormann committed suicide on May 2 during an attempt to break out of the city. After the enemy refused to lay down their arms, the assault continued. The battle continued for another day and night. At 6 a.m. on May 2, General Weidling surrendered. He signed the capitulation of the Berlin garrison and called on the troops to lay down their arms. By 3 p.m., most of the German units had laid down their arms. The 8th Guards Army had completed its clearing of the central part of the German capital. Individual German units and subunits, primarily SS troops who refused to surrender, attempted to break through to the west through the Berlin suburb of Spandau. However, they were destroyed and scattered. In total, over 130,000 people were taken prisoner. The Red Army's victory in the Berlin offensive became a decisive factor in the fall of the Third Reich.